Last week, I learned something new. There was an entire informal economy based on ramen, said Gibson Light, after presenting this August at the American Psychological Association. As NPR reported, ramen noodles are now the prison currency of choice. Because modern value systems just don't know what to do with criminals, I stand resolved. Convicts should have something better to do. Rehabilitation ought to be valued above retribution in criminal justice systems. Definition 1, rehabilitation is teaching. Quote, to teach a criminal in prison to live a normal and productive life, from the New Oxford American Dictionary. Definition 2, retribution is vengeance, from the same source. Punishment inflicted on someone as vengeance for a wrong or criminal act. Now, I have two groups of arguments. Argument group 1 is the test. How do you decide between retribution and rehabilitation? A, the test. Hierarchy of values. When multiple values are at play, their sequence and order of importance determines value. This test recognizes that not all values are equal. Instead, they must be arranged. Reason to prefer 1. It's the purpose of community. As professor of law Myers McDougall argues and he has law degrees from Yale, Columbia, and Oxford, in Jurisprudence for a Free Society in 1966, we organize communities by arranging the values sought and the strategies to achieve, shape, and share those values. So that's why communities exist. Reason 2 is that the topic is practical. You can breathe a sigh of relief that this isn't a debate about deontological ethics. It's a pretty straightforward approach to what works and what doesn't work in criminal justice systems. B, the debate burden, proper arrangement. For my side, the burden is to show that rehabilitation should be placed higher on the hierarchy than retribution. My opponent should attempt to upset my demonstration of proper hierarchy. Argument group 2, retribution should be lower than rehabilitation. Here's the thing. There are plenty of other values more important than either rehabilitation or retribution. So my stance is a little bit cynical. Neither rehabilitation nor retribution should be the primary value of criminal justice. But rehabilitation is of higher value than retribution. To prove this, I want to look at all 5 major values at play. Point A, 3 higher values. Value 1 is restoration. This is the concept that after someone has been wronged, the victim of that wrong ought to be restored. That should actually be the first priority of criminal justice systems. Value 2 is restitution. If we are going to restore someone, it is best that that restoration actually be done by the resources of the person who harmed them. Restoration is a higher purpose, but restitution is the best way to meet that purpose. So it's the second one in the list. Value 3, incapacitation. This is roughly safety for society by making sure that someone is, for example, restrained in prison and so on. But here's what's key is not to confuse incapacitation with retribution. According to the APA, quote, until the mid-1970s, rehabilitation was a key part of U.S. prison policy. Prisoners were encouraged to develop occupational skills, resolve psychological problems, and it goes on. But the idea is that prison is neither rehabilitative nor retributive. It doesn't have to be. In America, we have lately begun to identify prison as retribution, but prison doesn't have to be the punishment because rehabilitation can happen in prison. Now for B. 2 lower values. Value 4 is rehabilitation or teaching. There's some reasons it's right here in 4th place. A is it's tangible. Punishing is not as tangible actually because you don't necessarily change anything. When someone is punished, they're supposed to feel sorry, and so this is a mental value. But rehabilitation is actual change, and it's future looking as opposed to past looking, the improvement of a person. B, it's positive. Whether reading a book to cut 3 days off of prison in an Italian program, living with your family during the week and working, but spending weekends in prison in Slovenia, or making minimum wage while imprisoned in Poland, rehabilitation gives some hope for future positivity. And not all of these programs are just free lunches that cost society. They actually involve effort and work on behalf of the criminal. Now for value 5, retribution, or vengeance. A, it doesn't deter. It's very uncertain that first crimes, whether they're deterred or not, nobody really knows, and the studies are inconclusive. So this argument as the reason for retribution, nobody really agrees that it's true or false. It can't be proven. And it hasn't really helped deter second crimes once somebody's in the system, because in the United States, for example, around 70% of prisoners will recidivate, meaning they'll commit another crime within 5 years. But it gets even worse. There are studies that for every 3 months someone spends in prison, they're 5.6% more likely to commit another crime later. So the method of retribution that we have that is purely vengeance-oriented right now actually seems to make the problem of crime worse. B, it answers pain with pain. Even Friedrich Nietzsche could see this point. He said, quote, in what way may suffering be a compensation for debts, meaning crime? In that the act of making another suffer produced the highest kind of pleasure, a most remarkable counter-pleasure, the making of another suffer, a true festival, as it were. You see, retribution is more of a festival of pain. As Mike Materney argues in his comprehensive criminal punishment in the pursuit of justice journal article, quote, retribution in its essence is closer to vengeance than it ever will be to justice. If people mean it when they say, I want justice, not revenge, then retribution cannot offer them what they're looking for, close quote. It's because every perceived benefit of retribution can be achieved with incapacitation, restitution, or restoration, values 1 through 3, that I believe retribution should be completely cast aside. If it's included at all, it should always come behind rehabilitation. Ramen noodles may have replaced cigarettes as the currency of choice in prison, but don't these people have something better to do overall? I think they should. Vote for rehabilitation because teaching is more valuable than vengeance.
All right, good evening, Isaiah.
Hi.
Got a couple questions for you regarding your two main arguments. Before we get into the actual meat of the resolution, your second point, I'd like to discuss your first, that of the test.
Sure.
You're proposing this idea that there are basically 5 basic criminal schools of thought in the justice system, correct?
All going on at once, yes.
All going on at once. So we can agree that looking at any one of them in a vacuum is going to be a disadvantageous look at the resolution as compared to trying to have a summation of all of them.
Yes, I think they should be all arranged side by side somehow.
Mm-hmm. Isn't that more realistic? Because, I mean, if you're looking at criminal sentencing and how judges actually sort of prescribe treatment or punishments for criminals, a lot of the sentences they give have numerous parts of these 5 different individual things intertwined within, correct?
Yes, they're always balancing.
Okay. Now, I'd like to look at your third point under the test, that of the resolutional burden for the affirmative side. Can we agree that in order to prove this resolution true, you have to prove that we ought to be consistently placing higher emphasis on rehabilitation than retribution?
Yes.
Okay. Now, what does that look like in a practical sense? It's one thing to say teaching is better than vengeance, but where is the practical application in that? Where do we see this part of the resolution played out in a contemporary sense?
A judge should not sentence to vengeance without first having looked at the future of what is going to change for this criminal via some prior part of the sentence. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah. So suppose we had a criminal who was a little bit unhinged, and the judge was deliberating whether or not to give him an overly retributive sentence or an overly rehabilitative sentence. One maybe came at the expense of the other, just based on the individual. Is it your stance as the affirmative that in that sort of a scenario, we ought to choose the rehabilitative sentence rather than the retributive one?
If the person's mentally ill, yes.
Okay. All right. So now I'd like to look at your second point, that of basically retribution has less value than rehabilitation. Just so we're on the same page for moving forward with this round, it's your contention essentially that the top three forms in your mind of criminal justice, that of restoration, restitution, and incapacitation, that those three schools of thought basically subsume all of the positive things we could get out of retribution, correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions. Perhaps the only good thing to come out of Jurassic Park 3 was Alan Grant's quote, "Some of the worst things imaginable have been done with the best intentions." Now, the greatest fault of the affirmative speaker in this debate round is that he has taken a system so innately comprised of morality, so heavily moral in nature, and stripped it of its sense of right and wrong, adopting instead a consequentialist sort of whatever best fits society perspective. That's something we cannot afford to do in the criminal justice system, because the fact of the matter is this: if you are living in a righteous manner, you deserve to be protected. And if you're committing crimes, if you're doing evil, you deserve to be punished. It's by that standard that I believe the affirmative side of this resolution is negated. So in order to roadmap you for where I'm going to be taking this speech, first we're going to look at Isaiah's test of the resolution, his first grouping of arguments. Secondly, we're going to be responding to the meat of his argument, that of retribution has less moral value than rehabilitation, or just less value in general. And thirdly, I'm going to provide a contention or a point of my own, which I'll leave that up as a surprise. So the first place, that of the test. Isaiah had 3 points here. I'm going to go ahead and agree to his 3 reasons to prefer for his hierarchy of values, but I'm going to propose sort of a guideline for how we're actually going to look at those values in real time in this debate. It's one thing to say that we have 5 sort of pillars of the criminal justice system, but at any one time in history, any of those pillars have been, quote unquote, the most important or the most valuable to society. So in order to make sure that we're going about using the 5 pillars of criminal justice in a correct manner, I'm going to propose the guideline of moral justice. Moral justice. And what I mean by this is really simple. It's not complicated, the likes of, the Socratic method or Plato or anything like that. All I mean is that when we are interacting with the criminal justice system, we need to make sure we're protecting the innocent and punishing the guilty. By those 2 standards, we're going to be upholding the morality for which the criminal justice system is based. So those are basically my reasons to prefer. 1, do the right thing the right way. And 2, morals provide sort of a transcendent element to the criminal justice system. That way we don't get mired in current events or what is currently useful to society. We're going to make sure we're doing it the right way, or at least striving to. So with that, let's look at the meat of Isaiah's arguments. He had 5 basic points. The first 3 are not listed in this resolution. The 4th was rehabilitation, and then the 5th was retribution. So my response to this you can write down as a closer look at criminals. My response is closer look at criminals, and I've got 3 subpoints for you. Subpoint A is that of the acceptance of the first 3. Restoration, restitution, and incapacitation, I think we can agree may be more apt values than the 2 that are in this resolution. However, the conclusion that I come to versus the one that Isaiah comes to are profoundly different. Isaiah would say that those 3 sort of subsume the utility or the possible boons we could get from retribution, but I don't think so at all. And here's why. Subpoint B, the resolution is criminally focused. The resolution is criminally focused. The reason that we have retribution and rehabilitation in this debate round, as opposed to any of the other 3, is because rehab and retribution take unique looks not at the victims of crimes, not at society at large, but at the criminal and how the criminal's effect on society is actually dealt with. My contention is that rehabilitation takes morality out of that dealing and thus has greater negative impacts than the affirmative speaker would lead you to believe, which leads me to subpoint C. The retribution strikes a unique moral balance. Retribution strikes a unique moral balance. The affirmative speaker's point is that there are no possible benefits to be gained by valuing retribution at all in the justice system, essentially, because we have these other three superior networks within it. I think this is patently false, and I'm going to prove this to you in my contention. Before we go to that, I'd like to address a quick point that he made in his fifth point about retribution. He said that a retributive system can have no positive impacts, and his warrant for this was just using prison sentences. My point, or my response, is that of an inaccurate vacuum. His whole analysis of retribution focuses on a purely prison sentence, which I don't think is indicative of either retribution or rehabilitation, and not a good way to look at this resolution. So instead, I'm going to give you a 3 or 4 subpointed method of breaking down what exactly retribution is and why it cannot be undervalued in this resolution, thus negating the affirmative. So you can write down my main point here as retribution restores moral balance. Retribution restores moral balance. And again, I've got 3 subpoints for this. The first subpoint is that punishment will happen one way or another. This has been repeatedly proven. People, and by extension society, function in an innately morally conscious way. In a recent study, I believe it was 7 or 8 years ago, Kevin Carlsmith and John Darley reported that when people were given a moral scenario in which somebody committed a crime or committed an immoral act, not only their mental but also their neurophysiological response was that of a retributive sentence being necessary. The fact of the matter is this: when a moral atrocity is committed, the fabric or the moral balance that people seek to strike is thrown off. As such, people in society are innately built upon the premise that moral atrocities need to be balanced with retributive punishment. The problem then is introduced by rehabilitation when it is chosen over retribution. If a criminal is given, as the affirmative speaker has given value to, a majorly rehabilitative sentence over a robust retributive one, the state has not balanced the scale of moral justice. They haven't punished the guilty. And as a result, people make crude attempts at doing it themselves. Punishment will happen one way or another, which leads me to subpoint B. Failure to punish immoral action prompts revenge. Failure to punish immoral action prompts revenge. We see these cases all the time. We have systems of domestic abuse that are prescribed counseling classes or anger management classes, only to have the victim of domestic abuse ending up killing or seriously hurting the person that's been abusing them. We see rapists going into prison and being raped or murdered in jail. We see murderers getting out of jail because of, quote, good behavior or cooperative behavior in rehabilitative stances or getting out on bail, and then they're killed by somebody else outside in society. Why do these things happen? Because someone will always punish the offending party. As long as rehabilitative sentences are given more clout than robust punishment and fail to exact moral retribution that is due, people will feel obligated to take justice into their own hands. It's hardwired into the way that we are. That's just the way it is. And that's where revenge comes from. That's where the vengeance idea that Isaiah is proposing to you comes from. Which leads us to subpoint C. There has to be an alternative. Subpoint C is retribution administers just punishment. Retribution administers just punishment. Isaiah has asserted that retribution boils down to simply vengeance for vengeance sake. I wholeheartedly disagree, and I've got 2 standards for why retribution is actually differentiated from simple vengeance and is in fact a just moral punishment, thus balancing back the negativity that's been committed by crimes. The first standard is that of limitations. If it was just revenge, we would be looking at ideas like vigilantism, limited only by the psyche of the person doing it. But the fact of the matter is that retribution is a state-moderated punishment. It's committed or it's fulfilled under the oversight of the community. It's done up to the standards of laws, which brings us to the second differentiation, goals. A vengeance-related goal would be a hurt party exacting pain on the offending party for what was lost. But that's not what we see with retribution. Retribution is, in fact, the seeking of moral balance through punishment. The state functions as an outside party who goes into a situation and assesses what moral wrongdoing has occurred and how that in turn needs to be balanced. That way, people don't see it fit as having to balance it themselves, upsetting society, causing chaos. The opposite is that we want to enforce law and order, and through that, we want to enforce fairness within society. Thus, subpoint D is the impact. Championing retribution prevents revenge and upholds moral justice.
Hey, Devin, question for you about the idea of the state kind of limiting how much vengeance happens. Would you agree with me that you could still characterize this as some form of collective revenge rather than individual revenge for the wrong done?
What do you mean by collective revenge?
I mean, society is the one punishing this person for having veered outside of societal expectations and done harm.
Yeah, the traditional schools of thought in the retributive camp is that the moral wrongdoing comes from an offense against society or against the state. So that moral atrocity has to be balanced.
So the state is getting its revenge too, right?
If you insist on using the word revenge instead of just punishment, then sure, yeah.
Would you agree with me that you didn't provide a counter definition of retribution other than revenge?
Well, actually, my subpoint C about how retribution administers just punishment kind of debunks the definition of simple vengeance. I proved to you on two standards how it's different than just vengeance.
Could you explain to me what it includes beyond vengeance again for the definitional part of the debate?
Yeah, I'll do my best. So I believe it's different than simple vengeance in two ways. The first, normal vengeance is not limited except, say, for the psyche of the person committing it. I believe retribution is limited by communities overseeing it and through laws. Secondly, I believe the goal of vengeance is just the hurt party exacting pain on the offending party, whereas retribution aims higher, trying to seek a eye for an eye sort of moral balance based on what has been upset and trying to replace it. So basically trying to enforce law and order that way.
Got it. Okay, let's talk about the moral justice standard now, or the guideline, sorry. Would you agree with me that different societies have different guidelines as to what is moral?
Yes.
Would you agree with me that the resolution says the word systems, not criminal justice system?
Yes, I would agree with that.
And that therefore means that, isn't it true, the scope of this debate is beyond the United States, right?
Sure.
And would you agree with me that it's kind of global in nature?
Mm-hmm.
And would you agree with me that in some areas of the world, your mom wearing shorts outside or to the gym would be considered a violation of the guideline of moral justice in that society?
Well, moral justice in the sense that somebody is acting evil or somebody is committing a crime, in that sense, I think there's sort of a gray area. I don't really agree.
Okay, well, in the United States, if you walk around naked, that's an offense against society, right? So at some point, someone draws a line and says, this is wrong, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And in some parts of Europe, even that's okay, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks. Let's hear from Mike Materney again in his seminal article on criminal justice. Quote, "The strength of the argument, in fact, rests on the assumption that there exists a clear definition of justice, and that retribution fits within that definition. Unfortunately, the assumption is exactly what it is, an assumption, and it is anything but settled." My objection to my opponent's point of view is not that there's a wrong motive behind the concept of moral justice, and not that I'm against restoring moral balance, but in fact, the ability to implement in a system a choice about morality is so problematic that my opponent's position is non-implementable. My opponent says we should be afraid of prompting revenge, but there's something far worse. We should be afraid of Sharia law. We should be afraid of prompting implementation of moral codes of justice in systems in ways as my opponent described, because the core assumption of my opponent's guideline of moral justice is that there is one single objective moral stance of what justice is. And while I agree that there is one, What I disagree is that our system should implement one of those, or more, that we should affirm that about the resolution. And I think that's the fatal flaw. Now let's take a look at some of the points in order. My opponent says that my viewpoint is consequentialist. Actually, yeah, I kind of agree with that. It is consequentialist. At the point where we're saying, does this work or not work? We're taking a view of justice that is very realist or realistic. And Mike Materney says that that's the right thing to do here. He says, quote, an idea of justice that is anchored to reality. In this perspective, we could say that justice is the reparation of the wrong suffered, the restitution of the losses incurred, the compensation for the suffering endured. And why that's important is because if you look at my opponent's response with this guideline, while justice is highly undefinable, if we take a consequentialist viewpoint, we can actually arrive at my opponent's own words. He says we should protect the innocent and punish the guilty. That is exactly what the consequentialist position gets you. My opponent's position doesn't protect the innocent or punish the guilty as easily as it seems, because by what standard is one determined innocent or guilty? That's a different question. That we should protect and should punish is consequentialist. What the standard is that we're protecting or punishing against is a different question. Now, my opponent says take a closer look at criminals, and I have one basic response, which is that my opponent ignored values 1 through 3. He says that restitution, restoration, and incapacitation aren't focused on the criminal, they're focused on the victim. I completely disagree. And since my opponent has already agreed that those are more important, I believe this is the downfall. Because who does the restitution? Oh, the criminal. Who is incapacitated? The criminal. Only restoration ignores the criminal. The other two, values 2 and 3, do not, which brings us finally to my opponent's last point about the inaccurate vacuum in prompting revenge. When it comes to vengeance, I say actually restitution solves that. Yes, a parent who sees their child steal something in a store is going to make them pay back, and probably more. That's the visceral reaction, and the store owner will be satisfied. Because we as society also recognize that if the person pays back, that rights the wrong and tips the scale. They don't have to have punishment beyond that. They may, but they don't have to. And the same thing with prompting revenge. Restitution solves for revenge in a way that retribution doesn't. Restitution is complete rebalancing of the moral scale and doesn't require any vengeance at all to get there.
It's been my contention throughout this debate round that you can't try or you cannot set out to do the right thing the wrong way. And this is the point that I think Isaiah and I mainly disagree upon. And I still am firmly convinced that by going out and trying to satisfy things in a moral way, we not only preserve the moral balance that we seek to strike as a society, but also we tend to satisfy sort of the anger or the obsession that comes with crime and prevent it from being acted upon in a revenge or vengeance-oriented manner. And that's why I'm still firmly in the anti-rehabilitation camp for this debate round. So with this rebuttal, I'm going to have 2 points. First, we're going to discuss the test, the whole consequential versus morally based, how should we look at it sort of argument. And then the second, we're going to be looking at how Isaiah has missed the crux and the underlying presupposition that negates his side, which is going to be the meat of the argument. But first, let's talk about the test. My response to Isaiah's points in his last speech is essentially this. With either framework, retribution still emerges on top. So let's look at both frameworks and see what happens. The first is that of the morally based one, of protecting the innocent and punishing the guilty. My contention is that regardless of the differing community standards that happen, if you're talking about criminal justice systems, which are a primarily Western concept, that are backed by constitutions, by laws, that sort of thing. In any situation where you have retribution and rehabilitation, the requirements of the resolution before you, Having an organized, state-driven, law-upheld, community-overseen system is better than picking a rehabilitative stance, not satisfying the moral ground, and having somebody else, somebody who is not overseen, somebody who has wayward goals, having them do it. That's my contention on the moral side. The second is that of the consequentialist outcome. My response to this is pretty simple. A quenched moral ire. A quenched moral ire. Looking at things from a consequentialist outcome is as simple as this. Whatever works best, we should do. Isaiah has purported the idea that we should be using rehabilitation, except he hasn't really been arguing for rehabilitation. He's been playing with 4 pieces while I've been assigned 1, which I think is maybe not the most fair stance that he's taken. But his basic point is this. The outcome of retribution cannot beat or cannot be satisfied. The thing that retribution sets out to do, which is punishment, can be subsumed by the other points. And I firmly disagree with this point on the bounds that no other system, not even restitution, solves the moral upset prescribed to retribution. Because the whole point of the moral balance is that if it is upset, that means there has to be punishment. This is the key ingredient that Isaiah has ignored in this debate round. We're not looking at a system of angels where we don't have to have punishment. We're looking at a system of men, of people who are going to commit crimes. And because of that, like the studies that I referenced, we have a society in which it is ingrained that if you do wrong, it is expected and deserved to be punished, which leads right into the second voting issue, however you want to tag it for this round, and that's that punishment will happen. So we better make sure it happens in the best way possible. I've got 2 points for this. The first, or 3 points rather. The first is that people are moral beings. This is the most critical point in this debate round because Isaiah is saying the following. We don't need retribution because we have other more deontological or more positive forces that will do its job for retribution. That is untrue just based off of the way people act. People have a neurophysiological need to see and crave punishment when something is done wrong. Not community service, not restitution. Those 2 things are important, but they don't satisfy the moral imbalance that comes into play with crime. We have to have punishment because people are innately moral beings, and by extension, society functions on a moral basis. If somebody does something wrong, not only do they have to pay for it, not only do we have to protect the victims, but they have to be punished. And if we allow rehabilitative sentences to take precedent over retribution, the system is reversed, and we can't have that. This leads me to subpoint B. Rehabilitation fails to balance the scales. If we choose a rehabilitative stance or look at this resolution, by Isaiah's own words, we affirm a system that first asks, how can we fix this individual over how can we first pay for this crime and then go about mopping up the mess? That is a system that takes morality or just the questions of right and wrong out of the question. And for systems based off of constitutions and laws, such as the criminal justice systems that we have in play, that's a dangerous territory and a dangerous balance to try and strike, if not an impossible one. Which leads me to my final subpoint, subpoint C. Retribution answers. Retribution answers. I have 2 things that I want to discuss under this. The first is that retribution answers the criminal in a way that nothing else can. Retribution is simple. If you commit a crime, you ought to be punished. We've seen how that's innately bound on a personal level, on a societal level, and on an expectations level. Somebody deserves to be punished if they commit a crime. And if the state doesn't do it, somebody else will. Isaiah's completely ignored this point. If the moral balance is upset, somebody's going to right it. So we may as well use a state oversight, legal, community overseen system to do it rather than relying on the eventual conclusion that somebody else is going to do it for us. But that's the second point that I like to talk about. Retribution answers for society. Society has the general expectation that a wayward person ought to be punished for the sake of law, for the sake of order, for the sake of fairness. Those three values cannot be upheld if we put rehabilitation over retribution, because that takes just moral punishment, something that people in society need, out of the question.
One last time to Mike Materney, he says, quote, restorative justice focuses on the unique needs of the individuals affected by specific incidents of crime and invites them to participate in a personalized and private experience whereby they have the opportunity to consider what is necessary to help them heal. Offenders who are forced to face what they did and not allowed to take the easy way out or shift blame on the system or society or what have you. My opponent has ignored the benefits of restitution and restoration that make retribution absolutely unnecessary. Let's start by, we have just 2 points. First, the test, and second, that there's no need for retribution. Retribution fails the test. First, on the test, my opponent keeps talking about doing the good thing the wrong way. He says, better than taking the rehabilitation stance and letting private people take revenge. Here's the issue. The government and the state are still the ones enforcing restitution, restoration, and incapacitation, values 1 through 3. So my opponent has presented a false dichotomy here. Now he implies that maybe this is unfair. That's a new argument in rebuttals. I mean, I would have liked to challenge that, but I don't have much time left. I have 1 minute and 30 seconds left. So let's go down now to the second, which is how should we arrange this? And I say retribution is still last. And we can look at my opponent's arguments. He says restitution doesn't solve the moral scale. I disagree. Restitution perfectly solved the moral scale for the vast majority of history. You steal a cow? Well, you're going to give somebody a cow back or become a slave until you more than pay for the cow that you stole. It satisfies this psychological need for the criminal to pay back. Not to be punished by the state in a vacuum, but to be punished through restitution, which isn't even the punishment, it's the fact that you're restoring the victim. So we put the victim back at the center of criminal justice, just like Mike Materney said. And the flip side is that we already know where it leads when you don't do that. When you take my opponent's position, you get exactly what we've got. Pure retribution. We clinch tighter and tighter as the cookie crumbles, and 70% of people who go and get retribution end up going back to prison and committing crime again. It's a failed approach. So I agree that rehabilitation doesn't balance the scales of justice, but I disagree that it needs to. But even if you buy all of my opponent's arguments that retribution is needed, it's far too abstracted in this debate. You have 0 examples versus the APA, Slovenia, Friedrich Nietzsche, Italy, Mike Materney, NPR, Poland, the United States itself, rehabilitation not being a free lunch. We have examples on the affirmative side. So avoid and get rid of the festival of pain of retribution. I say help the victim by putting them at the center of the justice system and putting restitution on top. And when you do that, there is no need for retribution. So if you want to do something positive, you'll help teach the criminal a different way of life.